This is David Finzer for Truth and Lies Radio on the Overseas Radio Network. You can join our conversation by calling toll-free in the U.S. and Canada at 1-855-655-2121 or by Skype at ORN Live, or you can email me at david@truthandliesradio.com. And I got another email from my good listener Ray, and says, he wishes there was a peaceful separation, but doesn't think it's going to happen. I agree. I wish it would, and I would be back. But it's probably not, which means people have to think about getting out and finding ways to go. Now, I've got a little bit of possible good news, and I only can say possible, but as you know, I've been highly critical throughout my broadcasts about Latin America and about everybody moving there, but there's a little bit of good news coming out of Latin America, and if I'm going to tell the truth, I have to tell the truth even about things that I'm not too sure of. After coming under heavy criticism for pursuing so-called integration with totalitarian rulers in Latin America, the governments of Chile, Peru, Mexico, and Colombia, which have the best performing economies and the few remaining countries in the region that aren't yet under complete statist domination, announced the formation of a new regional body known as the Pacific Alliance. The new initiative, which was formally brought into being last week with the signing of an agreement by the four presidents, will not displace the growing patchwork of anti-national sovereignty schemes being erected throughout the hemisphere. Another problem that critics see and that I would worry about is the alliance's apparent attempt to court the communist dictatorship ruling mainland China under the guise of expanding trade with Asia. The avowed goals of this latest multilateral integration arrangement in the Americas are to expand free trade while promoting economic development in the four nations, which are among the most prosperous in the region. And other governments are welcome to join, and the relatively liberty-minded president of Costa Rica, Laura Chinchilla, has already requested membership. According to some press reports, the first official act to be undertaken by the Pacific Alliance is to drop visa requirements for travelers and businessmen among the member nations. Also on the agenda going forward is reducing or eliminating trade barriers, a supranational arbitration mechanism to preserve contracts and increase confidence in investment, to promote increased commerce with other Asian Pacific economies, and eventually alliance leaders would like to enable the complete free movement of goods, capital, and citizens between member nations. Now, I have a caveat with that last thing they want to have free, is the movement of citizens, because that has proved to be one of the biggest problems in the EU. The free movement of goods and capital, free trade, is a great thing and would build up all of those economies. Mexico is becoming quite an economy. And frankly, if the United States would abolish its drug laws, you'd wipe out half the crime in the United States of Mexico. That's actually their name, Estados Unidos de Mexico. But the movement of citizens free movement of citizens between member nations is a dangerous thing, because what happens is then people from poorer nations come into the richer nations willy-nilly. They create unemployment, they create social displacement. England is suffering that because it has one of the best economies in the European Union, and British citizens are being put out of work because people are coming from all over Eastern Europe where they're working for $400 or $500 a month, and they're depriving the poorest British citizens of jobs because they'll undercut them in the amount of work they'll do for the amount of work they'll be paid. And part of sovereignty should never be given up, and that is the right of a nation to determine whom it lets in and whom it keeps out. So while I think this is the most hopeful sign I have seen in Latin America, I still have some concerns and have to wonder whether or not it's talk without action. Because years ago, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Brazil created Mercosur, which was supposed to be a common market in the southern cone of South America, with this same goal of the free movement of goods and capital and a relatively easy movement of citizens between the member nations. And to this day, many years later, the only real thing that's occurred is you can travel amongst those countries without a passport with just your ID. So, for example, I am a permanent resident of the Oriental Republic of Uruguay, and so I can travel to Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil on my cédula, or ID, Uruguayan ID, without a passport. And it's even nicer because it's not machine readable, so Big Brother isn't watching you. But yet, Mercosur has proved to be a complete failure in promoting the free movement of goods and capital. Argentina is falling apart minute by minute. There's starting to be a run now on property values in Uruguay, and all those people who for the last couple of years have been listening to International Living and buying in Uruguay are losing the value of their property, much like Americans did in the housing crash. Because just recently, in the last few weeks, in fact, the price of property is starting to tumble. Why is it starting to tumble? Well, because in that so-called Southern Cone common market of Mercosur, Argentina restricts its citizens from taking out dollars. And so Argentinians who have money in Uruguayan banks or who have property in Uruguay are trying to liquidate it because Uruguay, because it now has a hardcore leftist government, is cooperating with Argentina, and they're afraid that their money's going to be frozen there too. And their investments are going to be frozen there too. And all of a sudden, you're starting to have a glut of the market, which is only going to grow. And Uruguay is so small compared to Argentina that they say when Argentina sneezes, Uruguay catches pneumonia. Well, Argentina has pneumonia, so one wonders what's going to happen to Uruguay. The central bank in Uruguay is artificially propping up the Uruguayan peso, but they can't do that forever. And Uruguay has alienated so many of its traditional friends because it was traditionally a neutral country, sometimes called the Switzerland of South America. As someone who was born a Swiss citizen, I always used to say on behalf of the country of my ancestry, I resent Uruguay being called the Uruguay of the Switzerland of South America, because it really isn't. And we have it's changed. I mean, they've recognized the PLO. They are dealing with all kinds of hardcore terrorist backing regimes, etc. And so they've gone from being a respected neutral country with a growing middle class to a left-wing socialist country with a decreasing middle class, with prices rising, salaries not, government intervention in lives increasing, and now on top of that, most Uruguayans who've been there for years, families live there for years, are property rich and cash poor. They're going to find that their wealth is going to be cut in half or maybe 2/3, like happened in the economic crisis in 2002. The good thing for those who are outside of Uruguay is sometime in the next year or so, I think it's finally going to be time to go in and buy property in Uruguay, because as Baron Rothschild said, the time to buy property is when the blood's running in the streets. You buy when things couldn't look worse, and you sell when things couldn't look better. Now, Spain has won EU banking bailout, but on its own terms. In convincing EU officials over the weekend to approve a $125 billion bailout, Spanish officials succeeded in using the threat of a Spanish economic collapse to secure aid for its troubled banking sector on its own terms. The aid will come without stringent austerity measures or structural reforms. The deal will also allow the EU to shore up the Spanish economy ahead of critical elections in Athens, which could lead to Greece pulling out of the EU. Things are getting very interesting in Europe. Okay, now we have to break again for a word from our sponsors, but we'll be right back, so don't go away. This is David Finzer for Truth and Lies Radio on the Overseas Radio Network. We'll be right back. This is David Finzer for Truth and Lies Radio on the Overseas Radio Network. Well, let's talk about hypocrisy. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, is the organization based in Paris, of course, which wants to abolish all privacy and wants what they call tax harmonization. In other words, they want all the countries to charge taxes as high as they do in France and Germany so that no one can compete with them. And these countries who are big on know your customer and due diligence and anti-money laundering, all of which I think can be good things, are all complete hypocrites. There was a Spanish website, and I read it, and my Spanish isn't sufficiently good, so I gave it to one of my staff to do a translation. And I just want to read you what was posted on this Spanish website. It says, 19 out of the 34 members of the OECD allow the issuing of bearer shares. Now, let me explain for those of you who might not know what bearer shares are. Bearer shares are shares in a company that carry no name, and the owner is whoever has the shares. U.S. companies used to issue bearer shares or coupons. The dollar bill is, in a way, a bearer share. It's a bearer bill of exchange, actually. Whoever owns it is whoever has it in their hand. And it's interesting the countries that allow bearer shares in at least some circumstances. And these countries include Germany, Austria, Canada, South Korea, Denmark, Slovenia, Spain, France, Israel, Ireland, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Portugal, the United Kingdom, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Switzerland, and Turkey. How can France and other member countries dare request the Latin American countries? This was actually written from one of the Latin American countries, where in Uruguay, for example, you pay extra not to have bearer shares. Bearer shares are normal. Most of Latin American countries are. In fact, their word that they use instead of incorporated at the end of a company is usually SA, which stands for Sociedad Anónima, anonymous society. And how dare these countries, these supposedly leading countries, a majority of the members of the OECD, how can they allow bearer shares and then raise hell when other less developed countries have bearer shares? I mean, this is absolutely ridiculous. And what they're starting to call for in Latin America is retaliation against these companies. And they quote international law. Retaliation is certainly legitimate because the state that employs merely acting under a right of sovereignty against the state which uses the retaliation, which cannot claim to be abused because it has applied the same procedures to be used first against your neighbor. In other words, if you do it, we're allowed to as well. And yet, there's this double principle. For example, if we applied the standards of credit issuing to the United States, along with the so-called PIGs in Europe, the United States has a higher debt to gross domestic product ratio than most of them. We have a whole situation where in the United States, as you know, the most secret company in the world is a Delaware company. A Delaware LLC, they don't issue bearer shares, they don't issue shares at all. You can incorporate that over or rather organize that over the telephone. It's amazing. You can do that in Delaware. You can do that in Washington, D.C. You can do that in lots of places. And these countries that are pretending to dictate to the world what is best practices and what is necessary to prevent the criminal use of companies all use this corporate form themselves. Now, I have been a traditional outspoken opponent of using bearer shares and have rarely ever used them because it smells. It smells just a little when you look at bearer shares. But in most of Latin America, it is common. An SA is an anonymous society in which bearer shares are issued and then freely can be transferred. And yet, again, we have this self-appointed international bureaucracy, one more, that tells the world what to do and what are best practices, yet none of them are businessmen. They're all academics and politicians, and even worse, these people who talk about tax harmonization are all international civil servants, and they pay no taxes, just like the UN, just like the EU, just like all of the other international organizations. Their employees are international civil servants and are above us all, and they are hypocrites. They are completely and totally hypocrites. It's do as I say, not as I do. And yet they're the ones who are pursuing this witch hunt against everything that can be considered offshore, and yet one of the key instruments that's been traditionally used offshore, bearer shares, for example, they issue themselves but tell everybody else they can't have. They demand that every company created in the world have a beneficial owner produced, and yet several of the United States, Delaware, Florida, Washington, D.C., it's part of the United States, though it's not a state, among others, will allow the creation of LLCs without any beneficial owner, the creation of companies without a beneficial owner. We simply create them, our company creates them with using a company, a Panama company, that has no assets, that but it keeps itself in good standing, and it serves as the subscriber or the incorporator to protect our clients' privacy. That's perfectly legal, but we know who our clients are. We subject them to proper due diligence. And you have to understand what due diligence is. Due diligence means that amount of investigation that is reasonably required to ensure that what you're doing is legal. And we, on a regular basis, have to take steps to clarify what some of our clients are doing, sometimes block accounts. We have found, as I've told you in the past, we have found criminals. We helped the Norwegian government catch an escaped prisoner who, first time we ran his due diligence on him, he came up clean. He wasn't on any of the reports. When we rechecked him, he was on the reports. So I called the police in Norway, got in contact, verified it was the same person, and we helped them track him by where the wires were coming to and going from. We helped the Czech government catch someone who was trying to extort money. Now, it's interesting that the one government that does not cooperate with us, the only one that's flat out refused cooperation, is the United States government, and only since Obama came to power. Before the Obama regime, even under George Stupid W. Bush, we could call and deal with the FBI and give them information, and there would be some action. But once Obama came to power, they didn't want the information. They didn't want it on stolen passports. They didn't want the information on people approaching us to send dollars secretly from Iran through us into the United States. They didn't want us in other cases where it appeared to us that there was clear likelihood that there was terrorist money laundering, where we offered to cooperate with the United States government. I even broke my own rule and made a trip back to the United States to meet with a member of the Homeland Security Committee, a member of Congress, and nothing happened. So it's all a big lie. My own experience is it's all a big lie. And fortunately, I have all of that documented. I have recordings, I have letters, I have emails back and forth where we have tried to help the United States government catch people who were really criminals. There's one guy, his name is Harold Sides, in fact. He's in Georgia. As far as I know, he's still out. He's defrauded over 5,000 people. And we tried to give those names to the United States government. In fact, the congressman with whom I met, there were several people in his own district that we tried to get them to do something, and they wouldn't do anything about it. So it's all a big lie, and it's a fraud. To quote, or at least paraphrase, Margaret Lady Thatcher, Baroness Thatcher, she said, it's not about equality. It's not about safety. It's about control. Well, now we're at the end of the show, so I have to go. I remind you that because America is becoming unsafe, expatriate your assets, then expatriate yourself. Because remember, you only have 3 choices left. Give up and become a serf, fight back in a civil war and probably lose, or get out. This is David Finzer for Truth and Lies Radio on the Overseas Radio